The sun was setting over Miami Beach, casting long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Shaquille O'Neal's waterfront mansion. The gentle hum of the air conditioning filled the room as the basketball legend sat in his favorite leather armchair, his large frame making the furniture seem almost small in comparison. His fingers moved across his phone screen, scrolling through news articles that made his heart grow heavier with each swipe. "Not again," he muttered, his deep voice barely above a whisper. Another story about homeless people being harassed by law enforcement had popped up on his feed. This time, it was about an elderly man who'd been forcefully removed from a public park where he'd been resting. The man had simply been trying to find some shade on a scorching hot day. Shaq placed his phone face down on the marble side table and walked over to the window. From his vantage point, he could see both worlds, the glittering Miami skyline and the hidden corners where people struggled to survive. His mind drifted back to his childhood in Newark, back when his family had struggled to make ends meet. He remembered the days when his mom had to choose between paying bills and buying groceries, the times when they'd worried about keeping a roof over their heads. I could have been there, he thought, pressing his palm against the cool glass. If basketball hadn't worked out, if I hadn't grown to be 7 feet tall, if I hadn't been blessed with these opportunities. The thought trailed off as he watched a group of tourists taking selfies on the street below, completely ignoring a homeless person huddled in a nearby doorway. His phone buzzed with a notification. Another news alert. Local police department faces allegations of discriminatory practices. Shaq picked up the phone, his jaw tightening as he read through the article. The story detailed how officers were selectively enforcing laws, targeting those who had nowhere else to go. Something stirred inside him, a mix of anger, sadness, and determination. He'd always used his platform for good causes, but this felt different. This wasn't about writing a check or making a public statement. This needed something more, something personal. Walking into his home office, Shaq looked at the wall of achievements. NBA championships, MVP trophies, his doctoral degree, and countless awards for his charitable work. But right now, none of that felt enough. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop, beginning to research homeless advocacy groups and civil rights organizations. Hours passed as he dove deeper into statistics, personal accounts, and documented cases of discrimination. His notepad filled with ideas, possibilities, and potential approaches. The more he read, the clearer it became. He needed to do something that would shine a light on this issue in a way that couldn't be ignored. What if, he said aloud to the empty room, what if someone like me experienced it firsthand? The idea seemed crazy at first, but it wouldn't let go. He thought about his years as a reserve police officer, his connections in law enforcement, his platform in the media. All of these could be powerful tools for change, but only if he could show the world the unfiltered truth. Shaq reached for his phone again, this time to make a call. "Hey, it's me," he said when the line connected. "Remember that conversation we had about making a difference? I think I know how we can do it. But you're gonna think I'm crazy." As night fell over Miami, the basketball legend stayed up late, drafting plans and making calls. His mansion was quiet except for the sound of his voice, strong and determined, as he set in motion what would become one of the most daring social experiments of his life. Tomorrow, he would start assembling a team: makeup artists, security experts, civil rights attorneys, and documentary filmmakers. But tonight, in the solitude of his home, Shaq felt more purposeful than he had in years. The lights of the city twinkled outside his window, and somewhere out there, people were preparing to spend another night on the streets. Soon, he would join them, not as Shaquille O'Neal the celebrity, but as just another face in the crowd, a face with a mission to expose the truth and fight for change. The morning sun streamed through the windows of a downtown law office as Shaq sat at a long conference table, surrounded by a small group of trusted advisors. His hands were clasped together on the polished wooden surface as he listened to their concerns. The room was tense with worried energy. "You're talking about living on the streets for a month. his longtime friend and attorney said, leaning forward in his chair. "Do you really understand how dangerous this could be?" His voice carried genuine concern, not just for Shaq's safety, but for everything he could lose. Shaq nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I understand the risks. But sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest changes." He pulled out his tablet and showed them the footage he'd been collecting. Clips of homeless people being woken up and moved along, their few possessions scattered, their dignity stripped away. A civil rights lawyer from the local homeless advocacy center spoke up next. She'd been taking notes throughout the meeting, her coffee going cold beside her legal pad. "If we do this," she said, "we need to do it right. We need solid evidence, proper documentation, and a clear strategy for how to use what we find." The discussion went on for hours. They talked about legal implications, safety protocols, and how to maintain his cover. The team grew more invested as they realized this wasn't just another celebrity stunt. This was a chance to create real change. "We'll need a secure way to record everything," said the security expert, drawing diagrams on a whiteboard. He explained how they could use hidden cameras and microphones that wouldn't be detected during police interactions. "The evidence has to be bulletproof," he emphasized, tapping the marker against the board. As the meeting progressed, Shaq's phone kept buzzing with messages. He'd had to cancel several upcoming appearances, including a children's hospital visit he'd been looking forward to. Each cancellation felt like a small price to pay for what he was about to do. "What about your family?" someone asked. The room went quiet. Everyone knew how close Shaq was to his kids, how he never missed important moments in their lives. Shaq took a deep breath. They understand. They don't like it, but they understand. Sometimes being a hero isn't about what you do in front of the cameras. It's about what you do when nobody knows who you are. The team broke for lunch, bringing back sandwiches to the conference room. As they ate, they started working out the practical details. They needed to create a believable backstory for his homeless persona, one that would stand up to questioning. They discussed common paths that led people to homelessness: job loss, medical bills, family breakdowns. "The key is to be invisible," the advocacy center director explained, spreading out maps of the city. She pointed out different areas where homeless communities gathered, marking spots where police interactions were most frequent. "You need to learn the unwritten rules of survival on the streets." By late afternoon, the plan was taking shape. They would start with a 2-week preparation period, time for Shaq to learn the mannerisms, the daily routines, the small details that would make his character convincing. He would need to change how he walked, how he talked, how he carried himself. As the meeting wound down, one of his advisors made one last attempt to change his mind. "You've already done so much for the community," she said softly. "Nobody would blame you for handling this another way." Shaq stood up, his full height making him an imposing figure against the setting sun outside. "Sometimes you have to become the people you're trying to help," he said. "Sometimes you have to walk in their shoes to show others the path they're walking." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed his words. They could feel the weight of what they were about to do, the potential impact it could have. This wasn't just about exposing bad behavior. It was about changing how society saw and treated its most vulnerable members. As they packed up their materials and prepared to leave, Shaq looked around at his team. 1 month, he said firmly. 1 month to gather evidence that nobody can ignore. 1 month to make a difference that could last for years. They nodded, knowing that tomorrow they would start turning this bold plan into reality. As Shaq walked to his car in the parking lot, he looked at the city skyline, knowing that soon he would see it from a very different perspective, from the ground up, through the eyes of those society too often chose not to see. The makeup studio was quiet except for the soft hum of equipment and occasional murmurs of concentration. Shaq sat perfectly still in a large chair as 2 professional makeup artists worked their magic. Their skilled hands moved carefully across his face, applying layers of specialized makeup and prosthetics that would change his appearance without drawing attention. The key is to make you look weathered, but not theatrical, the lead makeup artist explained, carefully crafting artificial wrinkles around his eyes. We want people to look past you, not at you. She'd worked on major movie sets before, but this project felt different, more meaningful than any Hollywood transformation. Hours passed as they worked on perfecting every detail. They grayed his facial hair slightly, added subtle marks and rough patches to his skin, and used special techniques to make his face appear more gaunt. A behavioral expert stood nearby, offering guidance on how to carry himself differently. Your height is our biggest challenge, the expert said, demonstrating a slightly hunched posture. Most people naturally curve inward when they've been living rough. It's a protective stance. Shaq practiced the position, feeling how it changed his presence from commanding to almost apologetic. They worked on his voice next. Speak from here, the expert guided, pointing to his throat rather than his chest. Softer, more hesitant. People who've been on the streets often lose the habit of speaking up. Shaq practiced different vocal patterns, recording them and listening back until he found the right balance. In another corner of the studio, a wardrobe specialist sorted through carefully selected clothes. Not new clothes, items that had been worn and weathered naturally. These need to look lived in, she explained, showing him how to layer the pieces. But they can't be too dirty or ragged. That would draw the wrong kind of attention. The team had thought of every detail. They'd even created subtle calluses on his hands, the kind you get from sleeping rough and carrying your belongings everywhere. They changed the way he walked, working with him until he could maintain a different gait that wouldn't remind anyone of his basketball days. Try everything on, the wardrobe specialist suggested, handing him the complete outfit. Shaq disappeared into the changing room, emerging as someone else entirely. The transformation was striking. Gone was the confident sports star and business mogul. In his place stood someone society might easily overlook. They did test runs with the hidden cameras, tiny devices integrated into his clothes and a worn backpack. The security team checked and double-checked every piece of equipment. Remember, they reminded him, the cameras are always recording, but you can activate the emergency beacon if you need to. Lunch arrived, and Shaq practiced eating differently, smaller bites, hunched shoulders, eyes down. The behavioral expert watched and offered corrections. People who've been homeless for a while develop certain survival habits, she explained. It's not just about looking different. It's about living different. The afternoon brought more practice sessions. They set up scenarios, how to respond if someone recognized him, how to interact with law enforcement, how to blend in with others on the street. Each situation was rehearsed until his responses became natural, unforced. Keep your ID hidden but accessible, the security expert advised, showing him a special pocket sewn into his jacket. It's your escape hatch if things go wrong, but it needs to stay your last resort. They created a whole backup system, a way to extract him if the situation ever became too dangerous. As evening approached, they did one final review. Shaq stood before a full-length mirror, taking in the complete transformation. The person staring back at him was a stranger, someone who might have had a different life, made different choices, or just had different luck. How do you feel? The makeup artist asked, making one last subtle adjustment to his appearance. Like I'm disappearing, Shaq replied softly, his new voice steady and practiced. Like I'm becoming someone the world doesn't want to see. That was exactly what they'd been working toward, but hearing him say it made everyone in the room pause. They'd succeeded in their task, perhaps too well. The man in the mirror wasn't just wearing a disguise. He was wearing the weight of invisibility that so many people carry every day. Remember, the behavioral expert said quietly, you're not just pretending to be homeless. You're learning to experience the world the way millions of people do every day. That understanding, that's what's going to make this project powerful. Dawn broke over the city as Shaq walked away from the van that had dropped him off in a quiet neighborhood. His heart was pounding beneath his layered clothes, but his face remained carefully neutral, just as he practiced. The weight of his worn backpack felt strange on his shoulders, everything he now owned reduced to a few essential items. The morning commute was beginning, and he got his first taste of what invisibility truly meant. A businessman nearly walked into him, eyes glued to a phone screen, not even noticing the large man in his path. Shaq stepped aside, remembering to keep his shoulders hunched, his gaze lowered. The lessons from his training echoed in his mind. Blend in. Don't draw attention. He found a spot on a public bench and sat down, just watching the world go by. Within 10 minutes, a store owner came out and started hosing down the sidewalk near him, the water accidentally splashing close to his feet. The message was clear: move along. No words needed to be exchanged. Walking through a park, he noticed how people created distance. Parents pulled their children closer. Dog walkers changed direction. Joggers gave him a wide berth. These tiny adjustments, these small rejections, they all added up. By noon, he'd counted 15 people who'd crossed the street to avoid passing near him. His stomach growled, reminding him it was lunchtime. He had a few dollars in his pocket, part of maintaining his cover, and found a small convenience store. The moment he stepped inside, the clerk's eyes locked onto him, following his every move. He picked up a cheap sandwich and approached the counter, keeping his movements slow and predictable. $2, the clerk said flatly, though the price tag clearly read $1.50. Shaq handed over the money without comment, understanding that this, too, was part of the experience he'd come to document. As he left, he heard the bell above the door chime, followed by the distinct click of a lock. The afternoon sun beat down hard, and he looked for shade. He found a spot under a tree in another park, but within minutes, a police car rolled by slowly. The officer inside made eye contact, a clear warning. Shaq moved on, his hidden cameras recording everything. He tried the public library next, thinking it would be a good place to rest. The security guard at the entrance gave him a long look, but didn't stop him. Inside, he found a quiet corner and sat down, feeling the air conditioning's blessed relief. But after 20 minutes, a staff member approached. "Sir, this is a place for reading. If you're not actively using library materials, you'll need to leave." Her voice was professional, practiced. How many times had she delivered this same message? As evening approached, the reality of his situation really sank in. The comfortable bed he'd slept in just last night felt like a distant memory. He needed to find a safe place to sleep, somewhere hidden enough to avoid trouble, but open enough to prevent being cornered. He found a spot behind a closed shopping center, where other homeless people had already set up makeshift beds. They acknowledged him with slight nods. No words, no questions. There was an understanding here, a shared knowledge of what it meant to search for safety in a world that wanted you to remain unseen. Setting up his spot for the night, Shaq realized his body ached in new ways. Not from physical exertion. He was used to that from his basketball days, but from the constant tension of being unwanted, unwelcome, watching over his shoulder. His back hurt from maintaining the hunched posture, his feet from walking all day, his neck from keeping his head down. In the growing darkness, he heard nearby conversations, snippets of life stories that would break anyone's heart. A former teacher who'd lost everything to medical bills. A young man who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. Each voice carried the weight of circumstances that could befall anyone. As he lay down on the hard ground, using his backpack as a pillow, Shaq stared up at the sky. The same stars shone above his mansion, but they looked different from here. A police siren wailed in the distance, and he watched as everyone around him tensed, wondering if they'd need to move, to run, to hide. His first day was ending, but he knew this was just the beginning. The hidden cameras had captured everything. Every subtle rejection, every moment of discrimination, every small indignity. But the real story, he realized, wasn't just in what the cameras could see. It was in these quiet moments, in the weight of being treated as less than human, in the strength it took to endure it all with dignity. The morning sun had barely risen when the first police encounter happened. Shaq was sitting on a bench near a bus stop, his backpack clutched close. Two officers approached, their boots scraping against the concrete. The hidden cameras in his jacket whirred silently, capturing everything. "Let's see some ID," the first officer demanded, not bothering with a greeting. Shaq noticed how different this felt from his experiences as a reserve officer. There was no courtesy, no explanation, just in command. He fumbled with his pockets, playing the role he practiced, pulling out the carefully crafted ID they'd prepared for his undercover identity. The second officer shone a flashlight in his face, even though it was daylight. "What are you doing in this area?" His tone made it clear that simply existing here was suspicious. Behind them, well-dressed commuters waited for their bus, pointedly looking away from the scene. "Just resting, sir," Shaq replied softly, using the quieter voice he practiced. "Waiting for the shelter to open." He kept his hands visible, movements slow and deliberate, just as he'd been trained. The officers ran his ID, made him empty his backpack on the ground, then told him to move along, the exact treatment his team had predicted. Later that afternoon, he witnessed something that made his blood boil. A young homeless man was sleeping in a park, hurting nobody, when an officer roughly shook him awake. The contrast was stark. Just 50 feet away, a group of office workers napped on blankets during their lunch break, unbothered. The hidden cameras kept rolling as Shaq observed more incidents throughout the day. A homeless woman was told she couldn't sit outside a coffee shop, while paying customers occupied every outdoor table. A man was threatened with arrest for loitering outside a grocery store, despite holding money to buy food. Around sunset, Shaq experienced the most telling encounter yet. He was walking down a busy street when a police car pulled up beside him. The officer inside called out, "This is a business district. You need to leave." Shaq looked around, noting how many other pedestrians were walking freely, unharassed. "Where should I go, officer?" he asked, keeping his voice respectful, but allowing a hint of genuine confusion to show through. The question seemed to irritate the officer. "That's not my problem," came the reply. "Just not here." The interaction was brief, but spoke volumes about the system's approach to homelessness. Moving people along without offering solutions, treating their very existence as a problem to be solved by making them invisible. As night fell, Shaq found himself in a small group of homeless individuals who were being cleared from their usual sleeping spot. The officers' bodycams were on, recording their professional behavior, but Shaq's hidden cameras caught what happened when those official cameras turned away. The subtle intimidation, the unnecessary roughness while handling people's belongings. Not all officers were hostile, though. One young officer actually stopped to help an elderly homeless man pick up his scattered belongings after someone had knocked him over. The contrast was striking. This simple act of kindness stood out precisely because it was so rare. Throughout the day, Shaq had counted 17 separate interactions with law enforcement. Some were direct confrontations, others just drive-by intimidation. He noted how the approach changed based on location. Aggressive in wealthy areas, more lenient in poorer neighborhoods, as if poverty itself was being zoned and regulated. The hidden cameras had captured it all. The varying tones of voice, the body language, the selective enforcement of laws. They recorded how an officer spoke kindly to a lost tourist just minutes after harshly confronting a homeless person who was doing nothing wrong. As Shaq settled into his sleeping spot for the night, he reviewed the day's events in his mind. His years as a reserve officer had taught him how law enforcement should work, but this experience was showing him how it often actually worked for society's most vulnerable. The evidence was building, documented in high definition, impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents. He pulled his thin blanket tighter, hearing the familiar sound of police sirens in the distance. Tomorrow would bring more encounters, more evidence, more stories to tell. But for now, he let the exhaustion of constant vigilance wash over him, knowing that each difficult moment was building towards something bigger, a chance for real change in how society treats its most vulnerable members. 2 weeks into his undercover mission, Shaq found himself sitting in a circle with 5 other homeless individuals, sharing a meal of donated sandwiches behind an old church. The evening air was cool, and someone had managed to find some cardboard boxes to sit on, making their concrete dining room a little more comfortable. An older man with kind eyes was telling his story. He'd been a factory worker for 30 years until the plant closed down. Had a house, a car, everything, he said, his weathered hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. Then the medical bills hit. My wife's cancer. His voice trailed off, and everyone nodded understanding. They'd all seen how quickly life could unravel. Next to him sat a young woman, barely in her 20s, who'd aged out of the foster care system with nowhere to go. They tell you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, she said quietly, but nobody tells you where to get the boots. Her words hit Shaq hard. He thought about his own children, safe at home, and how different life could be without a support system. The hidden cameras were still recording, but this felt different from documenting police interactions. These weren't just case studies or evidence. These were people becoming friends, sharing their stories, supporting each other in ways that society had failed to do. A man wearing a faded veteran's cap shared his struggles with PTSD, how the loud city noises sometimes sent him back to places he'd rather forget. The shelters are too crowded, he explained. Too many people, too many sounds. Sometimes the street feels safer. The others murmured in agreement. Each had their reasons for where they chose to sleep. As they taught Shaq the unwritten rules of street life. Which convenience store owners might let you use their bathroom. Which security guards would look the other way if you needed to get warm in a building lobby. Which librarians would let you stay a little longer on cold days. The key is to help each other, said a former teacher who'd lost everything in a house fire. Yesterday's lucky person shares with today's unlucky person. Tomorrow, it might be the other way around. She pulled out a small pack of wet wipes from her bag, sharing them around the circle. Such a simple thing, but out here, it was a luxury. They talked about their past lives, the jobs they'd held, the dreams they'd chased. An older man had owned a small business before the recession hit. Another had been a talented musician, playing in restaurants and at weddings until arthritis twisted his fingers. Each story challenged the stereotypes people held about the homeless. As night fell, they worked together to set up their sleeping spots. Everyone had a role. One person knew how to rig tarps for rain protection. Another had a knack for finding cardboard to insulate against the cold ground. They watched out for each other, taking turns staying awake as unofficial security. People think we're alone out here, the veterans said as they settled in for the night. But we'd got each other's backs. Sometimes that's all you need to keep going. Knowing somebody cares if you make it through the night. The next morning, they shared what little breakfast they had, a few granola bars, some bruised apples from a food pantry. Shaq watched as they divided everything equally, making sure everyone got something. The kindness he witnessed among people who had almost nothing was profound. One of the group mentioned a free clinic happening that weekend. Everyone made sure the information spread to others they knew on the streets. They looked out for job postings, shared information about which shelters had open beds, warned each other about dangerous areas to avoid. As Shaq sat with these people who'd become his friends, he realized his investigation had become something more than just gathering evidence. He was witnessing incredible human resilience, the strength of community in the face of adversity, the power of kindness when the world turns its back. A police car drove by slowly, and Shaq watched how the group naturally shifted closer together, offering silent support. They taught him that survival wasn't just about finding food and shelter. It was about maintaining your dignity, your humanity, when the world seemed determined to strip it away. 3 weeks into his undercover mission, everything almost fell apart. The morning had started like any other. Shaq was sitting on a bench near a small park, his backpack at his feet, when a young police officer approached. Something about this officer was different. He kept staring at Shaq's face, his expression shifting from routine authority to puzzled curiosity. "Sir, could you stand up, please?" the officer asked, his hand resting casually on his belt. Shaq's heart began to race, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate, just as he practiced. As he stood to his full height, he saw the officer's eyes widen slightly. The officer stepped closer, studying Shaq's features with growing intensity. Have we met before?" There was something in his voice, a hint of recognition that made Shaq's stomach tighten. The hidden cameras whirred silently, capturing every moment of this dangerous dance. "No, sir," Shaq replied softly, keeping his practiced voice steady. "I don't believe we have." But the officer wasn't satisfied. He pulled out his phone, glancing between the screen and Shaq's face. The makeup artists had done an incredible job, but they couldn't completely change his distinctive features. "You remind me of someone," the officer persisted. "Something about your eyes." He was young, probably fresh out of the academy, and clearly a basketball fan based on the way he was looking at Shaq. This was exactly the kind of situation they'd prepared for, but actually living it was different. Just then, a call came through on the officer's radio. A disturbance a few blocks away. The officer hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to respond and his nagging suspicion. Shaq maintained his pose, kept his expression neutral, though his pulse was racing. "Stay here," the officer commanded. "I'll be right back." He started walking toward his patrol car, but kept looking back, that puzzled expression still on his face. The moment the officer turned the corner, Shaq grabbed his backpack and moved quickly but calmly in the opposite direction. His mind raced as he walked through back alleys and side streets, putting distance between himself and the curious officer. The security team had prepared for this. He had several safe locations mapped out across the city. But using them would mean breaking character, potentially compromising the whole mission. Instead, he made his way to a different neighborhood, one where his homeless friends often gathered. They noticed something was wrong the moment he arrived. The veteran with PTSD recognized the signs of stress immediately. The slightly quickened breathing, the tension in his shoulders. "Cops?" the veteran asked quietly. Shaq nodded, and without another word, the group shifted to create a space for him in their circle, naturally shielding him from view. They didn't ask questions. Out here, everyone had their reasons for wanting to avoid attention. Hours passed, and Shaq's pulse finally returned to normal. But the close call had shaken him. That night, as he lay on his cardboard bed, he thought about how differently the officer had acted when recognition began to dawn. The subtle shift in tone, the sudden respect in his voice. It was exactly the kind of evidence they'd been hoping to capture. The next morning, he contacted his support team through the prearranged signal, a specific newspaper left in a certain trash can. They needed to know about the close call, needed to adjust his disguise slightly. But he made it clear he wasn't pulling out. They were too close, had gathered too much important evidence to stop now. His team responded quickly, arranging a brief meeting in a safe location. They touched up his makeup, made subtle changes to his appearance. But more importantly, they showed him the footage from yesterday's encounter. The transformation in the officer's behavior was stark. From dismissive authority to cautious respect in the moments he began to suspect Shaq's identity. "This is gold," the project coordinator whispered as they reviewed the footage. "This proves exactly what we're trying to show. How people get treated differently based on who others think they are." As Shaq prepared to head back to the streets, the makeup artist made one final adjustment to his disguise. "Be careful," she said softly. "But remember, this is why we're doing this. Every moment, every interaction, it's all building towards something bigger." Shaq nodded, pulling his worn cap low over his eyes. The close call had been frightening, but it had also reinforced his determination. He had one more week to go, one more week to gather evidence that could change how people saw and treated the homeless. He wasn't about to let one nervous rookie officer derail the entire mission. The conference room was packed with journalists, city officials, and community leaders. Camera flashes lit up the room as Shaquille O'Neal walked onto the stage, no longer wearing his homeless disguise. The transformation back to his normal appearance had taken hours, but traces of his experience still showed in his eyes, in the way he carried himself. For the past 30 days, he began, his voice strong and clear, I lived on the streets of our city. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people looked skeptical. Others leaned forward in their seats. Today, I'm going to show you what I saw, what I experienced, and what needs to change. The lights dimmed, and the first video began playing on the large screen behind him. The footage was crystal clear, showing his first day on the streets, the immediate change in how people treated him. The audience watched in silence as clip after clip revealed the daily reality of homeless life. This isn't about one or two bad experiences, Shaq continued, his voice heavy with emotion. This is about a system that has forgotten its humanity. He clicked to the next video, the scene with the young officer who had almost recognized him. The contrast in treatment was impossible to ignore. A city council member raised his hand, questioning the validity of the evidence. Shaq was ready. He brought out experts who had reviewed every frame of footage, civil rights attorneys who had documented every interaction. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable. But numbers and videos don't tell the whole story, Shaq said, his voice softening. Let me tell you about the people I met. He shared stories of the veteran battling PTSD, the former factory worker destroyed by medical bills, the young person who aged out of foster care. He kept their identities private, but made their humanity impossible to ignore. The room grew quieter as he played audio recordings of police interactions. The same officers speaking gently to well-dressed citizens, then harshly to homeless individuals minutes later. The difference was stark, undeniable. Some of the law enforcement officials in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I've been a reserve police officer, Shaq reminded everyone. I know the challenges our officers face. This isn't about attacking law enforcement. It's about changing how we approach homelessness as a society. He outlined specific instances where better training and resources could have led to different outcomes. Then came the most powerful moment of the presentation. Shaq invited some of the homeless individuals he met to join him on stage, those who were willing to share their stories publicly. The audience watched as these people, so often ignored, stood with dignity and spoke their truth. The former factory worker described how he tried to access services but got trapped in endless paperwork. The veteran explained how the noise and crowds of shelters triggered his PTSD. Each story highlighted different gaps in the system, different ways society had failed its most vulnerable members. As the presentation continued, Shaq revealed more than just problems. He presented solutions. He'd worked with experts to develop concrete proposals, better training for law enforcement, more accessible mental health services, streamlined processes for accessing help, and programs to prevent homelessness before it starts. This isn't just about awareness, he declared, his voice firm with conviction. This is about action. He announced the creation of a new foundation, funded initially with his own money, dedicated to implementing these changes. The foundation would work directly with both law enforcement and homeless advocacy groups. The room erupted in questions. Journalists wanted to know more about his experience. Officials wanted to discuss his proposals. Advocates wanted to know how they could help. But Shaq remained focused on his message. Today isn't about me, he said, gesturing to the people standing with him. It's about them. It's about every person who's been ignored, dismissed, or treated as less than human. Change starts with seeing people, really seeing them. And that's what these 30 days were about. As the press conference ended, Cameras continued flashing, but something had shifted in the room. The evidence was too clear, the stories too powerful, to be ignored. Shaq had done more than just expose problems. He'd created a moment that demanded change, and he'd backed it with both resources and concrete plans for action. 6 months after the press conference, real change had begun to take root in the city. On a bright morning, Shaq stood outside a newly renovated building, the first of several planned community centers designed to help homeless individuals get back on their feet. But this wasn't just another shelter, it was something entirely new. Inside, the former factory worker he'd met on the streets was now employed as a counselor, helping others navigate the system he once struggled with. His experience had become his strength, his understanding of the challenges making him uniquely qualified to help others overcome them. The police department had implemented new training programs, developed with input from both homeless advocates and law enforcement experts. Officers were learning different approaches to homeless outreach, focusing on connection rather than confrontation. The young officer who had almost recognized Shaq during his undercover days was now leading some of these training sessions. "It's about changing mindsets," the officer explained to a new group of recruits. "We're here to protect and serve everyone, not just those with addresses." The footage from Shaq's investigation had become a powerful teaching tool, showing exactly how subtle biases could affect behavior. The veteran with PTSD had finally found suitable housing through one of the new programs. The center offered private spaces for those who couldn't handle crowded shelters, along with mental health support tailored to individual needs. He now volunteered at the center, helping other veterans navigate their own challenges. Shaq's foundation had grown beyond its initial goals. What started as a local initiative had sparked similar programs in other cities. Police departments across the country were reaching out, wanting to learn from the new training methods. The evidence he'd gathered had become a catalyst for nationwide discussions about homelessness and law enforcement. The young person who had aged out of foster care was now attending community college, supported by a new scholarship program. "Everyone deserves a chance to chase their dreams," Shaq had said when announcing the program. "Sometimes they just need someone to open the door." Local businesses had joined the effort too. The same store owners who had once hosed down sidewalks to drive homeless people away were now participating in job training programs. The coffee shop that had refused service to homeless customers now offered pay-it-forward meals and job opportunities. The hidden cameras that had captured discrimination were now recording something different: moments of kindness, understanding, and change. Officers stopping to help rather than harass. Store owners offering water on hot days. Citizens stopping to talk rather than crossing the street in fear. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the city viewed homelessness itself. It was no longer seen as just a problem to be solved, but as a community challenge requiring everyone's involvement. The stories Shaq had shared had put faces and names to statistics, making it impossible to look away. 1 year after his undercover mission, Shaq organized a special dinner at the community center. He invited everyone he'd met during his 30 days on the streets, along with the officers, officials, and advocates who'd helped create change. The meal was simple, but the conversations were rich with stories of transformation. The foundation's work continued to expand. New programs were being developed, focused on preventing homelessness before it happened: rental assistance, medical bill support, job training. The evidence Shaq had gathered kept driving change, showing both what needed to be fixed and how to fix it. As evening fell, Shaq stood outside the center, watching people come and go. Some were there for help, others to offer it. The line between helper and helped had blurred. Everyone had something to give. Everyone had something to learn. The real heroes, he told a group of reporters, are the people who live this reality every day. All I did was shine a light on their stories. He gestured to the busy center behind him. This is what happens when we stop looking away and start seeing each other as human beings. The impact of his 30-day journey had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. It wasn't just about exposing problems anymore. It was about showing that change was possible, that communities could come together, that dignity and respect could transform lives. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning.